Well, what do we have here, boys? Tyler Morrison's voice carries across the abandoned grain silo with the lazy confidence of someone who has never faced real consequences. 19-year-old Emma Walsh hangs suspended from rusted metal beams 30 feet above the concrete floor, her summer work clothes torn and stained with blood from the struggle that brought her here. The rope cuts deep into her wrists as she sways in the humid Nebraska air, her boots barely scraping against empty space as she searches for any surface that might save her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Below her, 3 young men stand in perfect formation, their expensive sneakers crunching on scattered corn kernels that have been rotting in this place since the silo was abandoned 5 years ago. Tyler Morrison adjusts his designer watch with the casual precision of someone timing a science experiment, rather than witnessing a human being fight for survival. His father's political connections have taught him that some people simply matter more than others, and farm girls from County Road 18 definitely fall into the category of people who don't matter at all. Blake Henderson circles the base of the silo like a predator studying wounded prey, his sheriff's department jacket tied around his waist like a trophy of immunity. The badge means nothing to him personally, but the family name embroidered above the pocket represents 3 generations of law enforcement that has learned to look the other way when the right families need protection from inconvenient consequences. Ryan Cooper holds his smartphone steady with hands that have never known manual labor, recording everything with the detached fascination of someone documenting what he considers a routine Tuesday afternoon in rural Nebraska. His family's bank owns half the mortgages in Hamilton County, which means they own half the people who might otherwise ask uncomfortable questions about what happens to troublesome college girls who don't understand their place in the local hierarchy. But Emma Walsh is not struggling in the panic-desperate way her attackers expected. Despite the burning sensation in her lungs, and the pressure building behind her eyes as blood flow to her brain becomes restricted, her movements remain controlled and deliberate. Her gray eyes, already beginning to show the red streaks of burst capillaries, scan the silo's interior with the methodical assessment of someone who has been trained to read dangerous situations by the best tactical instructor she's ever known. On her left wrist, beneath the coarse rope that binds her hands behind her back, a military-grade smartwatch pulses with urgent biometric readings, heart rate climbing past 145 beats per minute, blood oxygen saturation dropping toward critical levels. But the device isn't just monitoring Emma's vital signs as she fights for consciousness, it's transmitting them across 200 miles of Midwest farmland, to another piece of technology strapped to the wrist of the woman who taught her that survival sometimes requires enduring the unendurable while waiting for the right moment to strike back. The watch belongs to Commander Jessica Walsh, United States Navy SEALs, currently deployed on a classified mission that has kept her away from Nebraska for 8 months. Jessica doesn't know that her little sister came home from college 3 weeks early. She doesn't know that Emma has been trying to protect 17-year-old Katie Miller from the same group of privileged predators who have been terrorizing Hamilton County for the past 2 years. And she definitely doesn't know that Emma is currently hanging from a makeshift noose in an abandoned grain silo, fighting to stay conscious long enough for military technology to bridge the gap between a Nebraska farm girl's crisis and a Navy SEAL's capacity for swift, decisive action. Tyler checks his watch again and announces to his companions that they have approximately 90 seconds before permanent brain damage becomes inevitable. His voice carries the clinical detachment of someone who has researched the mechanics of strangulation with the same thoroughness other people might apply to studying for a college exam. This isn't their first time playing this particular game, and the casual expertise they display suggests they've had plenty of opportunities to refine their technique on victims who lacked Emma's hidden advantages. The morning that would change everything began like any other summer day on the Walsh family dairy farm. Emma had been awake since 4:30, moving through the familiar routine of feeding cattle and checking equipment that had shaped her life since childhood. At 19, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from growing up in a family where competence isn't optional, and excuses aren't accepted. The Walsh farm had been producing some of Hamilton County's finest dairy cattle for 3 generations, built on the kind of stubborn determination and practical intelligence that turns 40 acres of Nebraska prairie into a sustainable family legacy. Emma's hands, already call used from a childhood spent learning that every piece of equipment on the farm represented both opportunity and responsibility, moved with practiced efficiency as she completed the morning milking. The work was demanding and repetitive, but it had taught her lessons about persistence and attention to detail that would prove more valuable than any college course she'd ever taken. Each cow required individual assessment, each piece of machinery demanded constant maintenance, and each day brought weather conditions that could either support or threaten everything her family had spent decades building. The Walsh family had never been wealthy in the way that the Morrison, Henderson, and Cooper families measured wealth. They owned their land outright, maintained their equipment through careful planning and mechanical expertise, and generated enough income to send 2 daughters to college without taking on crushing debt. But they were outsiders in the political and social networks that really controlled Hamilton County, which meant they had learned to be self-reliant in ways that would prove crucial when external support systems failed. Emma's father, Robert Walsh, had served 2 tours as an Army mechanic before returning to Nebraska to take over the family farm from his aging parents. His military service had taught him skills that extended far beyond dairy farming, including tactical awareness, equipment maintenance under extreme conditions, and the kind of leadership that earned respect through competence rather than inherited authority. He had passed these lessons to both his daughters, along with the understanding that the world could be a dangerous place for people who couldn't protect themselves. Jessica, 9 years older than Emma, had taken their father's military lessons and built them into a career that had carried her through Navy basic training, SEAL qualification, and 8 years of deployments that she couldn't discuss in detail but which had earned her a reputation as one of the most effective tactical commanders in her unit. Her rare visits home brought stories of international operations and specialized training that made Emma's college adventures seem mundane by comparison, but also reinforced the family's understanding that real strength came from preparation, discipline, and the willingness to take action when action was required. The smart watch that Emma wore during her summer farm work had been Jessica's gift before her most recent deployment, presented with the casual instruction to stay connected, and the more serious warning that Nebraska might seem safe. But predators exist everywhere, and they always target people who look vulnerable. Emma had initially considered the device excessive for rural farm life, but Jessica's insistence that she wear it constantly had been delivered with the kind of authority that made argument impossible. The watch was far more sophisticated than anything available to civilian consumers, equipped with GPS tracking that could penetrate areas where cell phone coverage failed, biometric monitoring that established baseline readings for stress and physical threat assessment, and most importantly, a direct communication link to Jessica's unit that bypassed civilian.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
In emergency services entirely. Emma didn't fully understand the technical capabilities built into the device, but she had memorized the emergency activation sequence that Jessica had made her practice until it became muscle memory. Emma's morning routine was interrupted by a sound that had become increasingly familiar over the past 3 weeks since her return from college. Katie Miller's voice, high and desperate, calling for help from somewhere beyond the tree line that separated the Walsh farm from the abandoned Miller grain silo. Emma dropped the feed bucket she had been carrying, and ran toward the sound, her protective instincts overriding the caution that 2 years of increasingly dangerous encounters with Tyler Morrison's group had taught her. Katie Miller was 17 years old, the daughter of migrant workers who had been trying to establish permanent residency in Hamilton County for the past 5 years. Her parents worked 18-hour days in the corn and soybean fields that surrounded Millbrook, sending most of their earnings to extended family in Mexico, while saving every possible dollar toward purchasing a small house that would give their daughter stability during her final year of high school. Katie was intelligent, hard-working, and determined to become the first person in her family to attend college, but her status as an outsider had made her a target for the kind of systematic harassment that Tyler Morrison's group used to maintain their position at the top of the local social hierarchy. Emma had first encountered Katie 3 weeks ago, when she found the girl hiding in the Walsh family's barn after escaping what she described as another game that Tyler's group liked to play with students they considered beneath their social status. The details Katie had shared about these games revealed a pattern of escalating violence that went far beyond typical teenage bullying, involving systematic psychological torture, physical assault, and threats that were backed up by the political and legal immunity that came with being born into the right families. Emma's attempts to report these incidents to local law enforcement had been met with the kind of bureaucratic resistance that made it clear the Henderson family's control over the sheriff's department extended to protecting Tyler Morrison and Ryan Cooper from any consequences for their actions. Deputy Maria Santos, one of the few honest law enforcement officers in Hamilton County, had warned Emma privately that pursuing official complaints would likely result in retaliation rather than justice, and that Katie's immigration status made her particularly vulnerable to the kind of legal harassment that could destroy her family's chances of establishing permanent residency. The abandoned Miller grain silo, where Emma now found herself suspended from rusted metal beams, had been the site of at least 3 previous incidents involving Tyler's group, according to Katie's whispered accounts of violence that had been carefully hidden from adults who might intervene. The silo's isolation, combined with its acoustic properties that contained sound and its structural layout, that provided multiple escape routes for attackers, made it an ideal location for the kind of violence that required privacy and the ability to disappear quickly if unexpected witnesses arrived. Emma's decision to respond to Katie's call for help had been made without consideration for her own safety, driven by the protective instincts that her father and sister had taught her were more important than personal preservation. She had arrived at the silo to find Katie bound with zip ties and suspended from a rope that showed clear evidence of previous use for similar purposes. The efficiency with which Tyler's group had restrained both girls suggested extensive practice and planning, indicating that Emma had walked into a trap that had been carefully prepared in advance. The rope that now supported Emma's full body weight above the concrete floor had been professionally rigged with the kind of knots and hardware that indicated someone in the group had received training in climbing or rescue techniques. The irony that skills designed to save lives were being used to threaten them wasn't lost on Emma, who recognized the quality of the equipment even as it cut into her wrists and restricted her breathing. Tyler Morrison's casual competence with the rigging suggested that their previous victims had provided opportunities to refine techniques that were now being applied with deadly precision. Emma's initial attempts to negotiate Katie's release had been met with the kind of casual cruelty that revealed the true nature of what she was facing. Tyler's group wasn't motivated by temporary anger or situational conflict. They were operating according to a systematic approach to violence that treated certain categories of people as expendable entertainment, and Emma's interference in their treatment of Katie had simply provided them with an additional target for their practiced brutality. The zip ties that bound Emma's wrists had been applied with professional tightness, cutting off circulation to her hands while ensuring that any struggle would only increase the pressure and accelerate the onset of nerve damage. Blake Henderson's law enforcement training had apparently included instruction in restraint techniques that were now being applied for torture rather than legitimate police work, another example of how institutional authority was being perverted to serve private violence. Ryan Cooper's smartphone documentation of Emma's suspension served multiple purposes beyond simple sadistic entertainment. The video evidence could be used to blackmail Emma's family into silence, to demonstrate the group's power to future victims, and to provide detailed analysis of techniques that could be refined for future applications. The clinical thoroughness with which Ryan recorded every aspect of Emma's physical distress suggested that this documentation served the same function as a laboratory notebook, preserving information that would improve their efficiency in future operations. Emma's controlled response to her situation puzzled her attackers, who expected panic and desperate pleading rather than the methodical assessment she was conducting of her environment and options. Her ability to remain calm while fighting for consciousness came from lessons Jessica had taught her about surviving extreme situations, including breathing techniques that maximized oxygen efficiency and mental strategies that maintained tactical awareness, even under severe physical stress. The military smartwatch hidden beneath the ropes that bound Emma's wrists had automatically activated its emergency protocols the moment her biometric readings indicated life-threatening danger. The device was currently transmitting her GPS coordinates, vital signs and audio pickup to Jessica's unit communication system, creating a real-time link between the grain silo and whatever classified location currently housed. Commander Jessica Walsh and her tactical team. Emma had no way of knowing whether Jessica would receive the emergency transmission in time to respond, or whether military regulations would permit her to take action based on civilian emergency signals. But the watch represented her only connection to the kind of help that could match the level of violence she was currently facing, and her sister's final words before deployment had been a promise that she would always find a way to respond when Emma needed her. The afternoon sun streaming through broken windows in the silo's upper levels created a patchwork of light and shadow that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The building had once represented prosperity and community cooperation, providing storage and processing facilities that supported dozens of local farming families. Its abandonment 5 years ago had symbolized the economic pressures that were forcing small farmers out of business, creating the kind of social instability that allowed predators like Tyler's group to operate without effective community resistance. Emma's fight for survival in the place where Katie Miller's grandfather had once worked 12-hour days to support his family carried symbolic weight that extended beyond her personal crisis. The grain silo represented everything that Hamilton County had once been, and everything it was becoming. A monument to honest work that had been transformed into a playground for wealthy teenagers who had never learned that actions carried consequences. Tyler Morrison's announcement that Emma had 90 seconds before permanent brain damage became inevitable was delivered with the casual precision of someone who had researched the topic thoroughly enough to provide accurate medical information. His knowledge of strangulation physiology suggested that previous victims had provided opportunities to study the effects of their techniques, turning violence into a form of perverted scientific research that satisfied their curiosity about human suffering, while maintaining the clinical detachment that allowed them to avoid acknowledging the moral implications of their actions. The grain silo's acoustics amplified every sound, from Emma's controlled breathing to the casual conversation of her attackers, creating an audio environment that intensified the psychological pressure of her situation. The echoes of Tyler's voice as he provided his 90-second countdown seemed to come from every direction at once, reinforcing her isolation and the apparent hopelessness of her situation. But Emma Walsh had been raised by people who understood that hopeless situations sometimes contained hidden opportunities, and that survival often required enduring the unendurable while waiting for circumstances to change. Her sister's training had taught her that 90 seconds could be enough time for everything to change, if you knew how to use those seconds effectively and if you had prepared for exactly this kind of crisis. The military smartwatch on Emma's wrist pulsed with incoming data, indicating that her emergency transmission had been received and acknowledged by systems that operated far beyond the reach of Hamilton County's corrupt local authorities. Emma couldn't see the display through the ropes that bound her arms, but she could feel the device's vibration pattern indicating that help was not just coming but was already in motion. Somewhere beyond the Nebraska prairie, Commander Jessica Walsh was about to learn that her little sister was hanging from a rope in an abandoned grain silo, fighting for her life against the kind of predators who had never faced an opponent with the training, resources, and absolute determination to ensure that their reign of terror was about to end permanently. Part 2. Controlled response 200 miles northeast of the abandoned grain silo. Commander Jessica Walsh felt her tactical watch vibrate against her wrist with a pattern that made her blood turn to ice. The emergency signal cut through the humid Virginia air where she stood reviewing mission protocols with her SEAL team, transforming a routine training briefing into something that demanded immediate action. The biometric data streaming across her watch display told a story that no military commander ever wanted to read about their own family member. Heart rate elevated beyond normal stress parameters. Blood oxygen levels dropping toward critical thresholds. GPS coordinates placing the emergency in rural Nebraska, specifically at a location that Jessica recognized from childhood adventures with her younger sister. The abandoned Miller grain silo had been off limits during their teenage years, declared structurally unsound by county inspectors who lacked the political will to force its demolition. Now it was serving as the location for what appeared to be a life-threatening assault on the person Jessica cared about most in the world. The tactical data flooding Jessica's watch revealed information that civilian emergency services would never be able to interpret correctly. Emma's heart rate pattern indicated sustained physical stress combined with restricted breathing, while her GPS coordinates had remained stationary for the past 12 minutes in a location where no legitimate activity should be taking place. Most critically, the audio pickup from Emma's watch was transmitting sounds that Jessica's combat experience allowed her to identify with terrifying clarity. Male voices discussing timing and technique with the casual expertise of people who had practiced violence extensively. The acoustic signature of a large enclosed space with concrete surfaces and metal structural elements. Most damning of all, the sound of rope under tension and the labored breathing of someone fighting to maintain consciousness while suspended above a hard surface. Jessica had heard these sounds before in places where American personnel had been captured by hostile forces, and she knew exactly what they meant. The emergency protocols built into Emma's watch had been designed by Jessica personally, using her access to classified military technology to create a communication system that could bypass civilian authorities when circumstances required immediate military intervention. The device contained encryption software that linked directly to Jessica's unit communication network GPS tracking that operated independently of civilian satellite systems, and most importantly, legal documentation that authorized Jessica to respond to family emergencies under specific military protocols designed to protect service members' immediate relatives. Jessica's commanding officer, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, appeared at her shoulder within seconds of the emergency alert activation, drawn by the distinctive sound of military-grade communication equipment receiving priority signals. His expression shifted from routine curiosity to professional concern as Jessica briefed him on the situation developing in Nebraska, using the clinical language that military personnel employed to maintain operational focus during personal crises. The legal framework that would allow Jessica to respond to Emma's emergency had been established through military regulations that recognized the unique vulnerabilities faced by service members' families when their protectors were deployed overseas. Jessica's specialized training and security clearance meant that her family members were considered potential targets for foreign intelligence services or domestic terrorist groups, which created legal justification for military intervention when civilian authorities proved inadequate or compromised. Captain Rodriguez reviewed the biometric data streaming from Emma's watch with the rapid assessment skills that had earned him command authority over one of the Navy's most elite tactical units. The information painted a clear picture of imminent lethal threat occurring in a location where local law enforcement had historically demonstrated either incompetence or corruption. The combination of these factors triggered military protocols that authorized immediate response using whatever resources were necessary to prevent the death of a service member's immediate family. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter that would carry Jessica's rescue team to Nebraska was already being prepared for departure, its crew moving with the practiced efficiency that turned emergency response into a precisely choreographed military operation. The aircraft had been scheduled for a training exercise that afternoon, which provided perfect cover for a mission that would officially be classified as extended tactical training rather than domestic intervention. The paperwork would be filed in a way that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while avoiding the political complications that could arise from unauthorized military operations on American soil. Jessica's tactical team consisted of 4 additional SEAL operators, each of whom brought specialized skills that would prove crucial during the rescue operation developing in Hamilton County. Petty Officer First Class David Kim was a communications specialist whose equipment could intercept and jam civilian radio frequencies, preventing local authorities from interfering with the rescue until federal agents could secure the area. Petty Officer Second Class Amanda Foster specialized in precision marksmanship and tactical entry, skills that would be essential if the situation required neutralizing hostile forces while protecting civilian lives. Chief Petty Officer Michael Torres brought expertise in explosive breaching and tactical medicine, allowing the team to gain access to fortified positions while providing emergency medical care to victims who had sustained serious injuries. Petty Officer 3rd Class Robert Martinez was a surveillance and reconnaissance specialist whose equipment could provide real-time intelligence about the tactical situation before the team committed to direct action. Together they represented the kind of overwhelming force multiplication that could transform a hopeless situation into a controlled military operation. The flight plan Jessica filed with military air traffic control indicated a routine training mission that would take her team across 3 states while practicing low-level navigation and tactical insertion techniques. The route happened to include a scheduled fuel stop at a civilian airport 30 miles from Millbrook, Nebraska, which would place them within helicopter range of Emma's location with sufficient fuel reserves to complete whatever rescue operation the situation demanded. Jessica's personal equipment loadout reflected the dual nature of her mission, combining the tactical gear necessary for a combat rescue with the legal documentation required to justify military intervention in civilian law enforcement matters. Her body armor contained identification that would be recognized by federal agencies, while her weapon systems were configured for precise application of force that could neutralize threats without causing collateral damage to innocent civilians or civilian infrastructure. The intelligence briefing Jessica conducted during the helicopter flight to Nebraska revealed disturbing patterns in Hamilton County's recent history obtained through military databases that track domestic security threats and corruption in local government institutions. Tyler Morrison's father had been flagged by federal investigators as a person of interest in several cases involving misuse of county funds and interference with federal civil rights investigations. Blake Henderson's family connections to local law enforcement had generated multiple complaints to the FBI about systematic protection of wealthy families who committed violent crimes against vulnerable populations. Ryan Cooper's family banking empire had been subject to Treasury Department scrutiny for financial transactions that appeared designed to launder money obtained through illegal activities, including drug trafficking and human trafficking operations that exploited migrant worker communities throughout the Midwest. The pattern that emerged from this intelligence indicated that Emma had stumbled into something far more dangerous than
Teenage bullying, involving organized criminal activity that was protected by corrupt local institutions. The tactical assessment Jessica conducted while approaching Nebraska airspace revealed that Emma's emergency was part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years, protected by a network of family connections that controlled every level of law enforcement and political authority in Hamilton County. The 3 young men currently threatening Emma's life represented the next generation of this criminal dynasty, raised to believe that violence against vulnerable populations was both their right and their responsibility as members of the local ruling class. Jessica's military training had taught her to recognize the signs of systematic oppression that created environments where individual predators could operate without constraint. Hamilton County displayed all the characteristics of a community where democratic institutions had been captured by criminal interests, creating the kind of lawless territory that required federal intervention to restore basic civil rights protections. Emma's current crisis was simply the most visible symptom of a much deeper problem that would require comprehensive solutions extending far beyond immediate rescue operations. The communications intercepts that Jessica's team gathered during their approach to Nebraska provided real-time intelligence about the tactical situation developing at the grain silo. Tyler Morrison's group was using encrypted messaging applications to coordinate with additional supporters who were positioned around the silo perimeter, indicating that Emma had walked into an ambush that involved more participants than the 3 young men currently visible inside the building. Blake Henderson had used his family connections to monitor local law enforcement radio frequencies, ensuring that his group would receive advance warning if any civilian authorities attempted to respond to reports of suspicious activity at the grain silo. This level of operational security suggested extensive training and planning, elevating what appeared to be random violence into something that resembled organized criminal activity with tactical sophistication that matched many international terrorist organizations. Ryan Cooper's financial resources had been used to purchase military-grade equipment that was supposed to be restricted to law enforcement and military personnel, including communications gear that could jam civilian cell phone networks and surveillance equipment that provided early warning about approaching vehicles or aircraft. The fact that civilian teenagers had access to this level of tactical technology indicated corruption that extended far beyond local political institutions into federal agencies responsible for controlling weapons and surveillance equipment. Jessica's tactical plan for rescuing Emma required coordination with federal agencies that had been investigating Hamilton County corruption for months without achieving sufficient evidence to justify large-scale intervention. The emergency developing at the grain silo provided the perfect opportunity to gather evidence while conducting a legitimate rescue operation, creating a legal framework that would allow federal prosecutors to dismantle the entire criminal network that had been terrorizing the region's most vulnerable populations. The approach vector Jessica's helicopter pilot used to reach the grain silo was designed to minimize detection while maximizing tactical surprise, following terrain features that would mask the aircraft's acoustic signature until it was too late for the perpetrators to escape or destroy evidence. The timing of their arrival was calculated to coincide with the point when Emma's physical condition would require immediate medical intervention, ensuring that the rescue operation would be both legally justified and tactically decisive. Jessica's final equipment check revealed everything she would need to transform her sister's nightmare into a demonstration of what happened when predators finally encountered someone with superior training, better equipment, and the absolute determination to ensure that justice would be served with military precision. The grain silo that had been a place of terror for Emma was about to become a classroom where 3 wealthy teenagers would learn that some people fought back with capabilities that exceeded their worst nightmares. Part 3 First Engagement Hook. Emma's controlled breathing pattern served multiple purposes beyond merely maintaining consciousness during her suspension from the grain silo's metal framework. The technique Jessica had taught her during childhood summers was originally designed for underwater survival, allowing swimmers to maximize oxygen efficiency while minimizing panic responses that could lead to drowning. Applied to her current situation, the breathing protocol was keeping Emma alive while simultaneously activating the most sophisticated emergency response system that had ever been deployed to protect a civilian family member. The military smartwatch hidden beneath the ropes that bound Emma's wrists was transmitting far more information than her attackers could possibly imagine. Beyond the basic biometric data that indicated life-threatening distress, the device was conducting real-time tactical analysis of her environment, using audio pickup to identify the number of potential threats, acoustic mapping to determine the interior layout of the grain silo, and electromagnetic sensors to detect the presence of weapons or communication equipment that might complicate a rescue operation. Tyler Morrison's casual announcement of Emma's remaining survival time revealed ignorance about the technology that was currently analyzing every word he spoke, and transmitting his voice pattern to databases that would enable positive identification even if he attempted to flee before law enforcement arrived. His detailed knowledge of strangulation physiology was being recorded as evidence of premeditation, while his casual references to previous victims provided prosecutors with information that would support multiple murder charges once the current crisis was resolved. Blake Henderson's use of his family's law enforcement connections to monitor radio frequencies was being tracked by military signals intelligence equipment that could not only intercept his communications but also identify every participant in his surveillance network. His assumption that civilian authorities represented the only potential threat had blinded him to the possibility that military intervention might bypass local corruption entirely, bringing federal resources that operated according to different rules and answered to different authorities. Ryan Cooper's smartphone documentation of Emma's torture was being intercepted and copied by military cyber warfare specialists who could access his device remotely without triggering any of the security protocols he had installed to protect his files. His detailed video record of the crime was simultaneously providing evidence for future prosecution and real-time intelligence about the tactical situation that would enable Jessica's team to plan their intervention with precision that matched their overwhelming superiority in training and equipment. The grain silos isolation, which Tyler's group had selected specifically to prevent interference from potential witnesses, was actually working in Jessica's favor by creating an environment where military force could be applied without risking civilian casualties or media attention that might complicate the legal aspects of federal intervention. The building's acoustic properties, designed to contain sound during its operational years, would now contain the sounds of a tactical operation that would demonstrate the difference between amateur violence and professional military action. Emma's apparent helplessness was serving as perfect psychological camouflage for the rescue operation that was currently approaching Hamilton County airspace, with the speed and precision that characterized elite military units responding to imminent threats against their personnel. Tyler Morrison's group had made the fatal mistake of assuming that farm girls from rural Nebraska lacked the resources or connections to fight back against wealthy families who controlled local institutions through corruption and intimidation. The emergency protocols built into Emma's watch had been designed by someone who understood that evil people often succeeded because good people lacked the tools or training to fight back effectively. Jessica's military service had exposed her to situations where American citizens were threatened by hostile forces that operated beyond the reach of civilian law enforcement, creating the expertise necessary to design protection systems that could bridge the gap between civilian vulnerability and military capability. Emma's college education had included coursework in criminal justice and civil rights law, providing her with theoretical knowledge about how democratic institutions were supposed to protect vulnerable populations from systematic oppression. Her current situation was demonstrating the gap between legal theory and practical reality, while simultaneously proving that sometimes justice required the application of force by people who possessed both the legal authority and tactical capability to confront organized criminal activity that had captured local government institutions. The rope that supported Emma's weight above the concrete floor had been selected and rigged by people who possessed technical knowledge but lacked the wisdom to understand that their actions would trigger responses they were completely unprepared to handle. Tyler Morrison's confidence in his family's political protection would prove meaningless when federal agencies arrived with evidence of crimes that demanded accountability regardless of local power structures. Blake Henderson's law enforcement training had taught him how to use official authority to protect criminals rather than serve justice, but it had not prepared him for situations where military personnel operated according to different rules and answered to higher authorities. His family's control over local sheriff's department resources would become a liability rather than an asset once federal investigators began examining how those resources had been systematically misused to enable violent crimes against protected populations. Ryan Cooper's financial resources had purchased equipment and influence that seemed overwhelming when applied against vulnerable farm families and migrant workers who lacked political connections or legal representation. But his family's wealth would prove inadequate when confronted by military assets that represented billions of dollars in taxpayer investment, operated by personnel whose training costs exceeded the total value of Cooper family holdings, and backed by federal legal authority that transcended local corruption networks. The shadows cast by afternoon sunlight streaming through broken windows in the grain silos' upper levels created a patchwork of light and darkness that would soon conceal the approach of people who moved through shadows as naturally as other people walked down sidewalks. Emma's attackers were accustomed to operating in environments where they possessed overwhelming advantages in resources, legal protection, and political influence. They were about to discover what happened when those advantages were not just neutralized but completely reversed by people who specialized in applying superior force against criminal organizations. Emma's fight for survival was taking place in a community where systematic corruption had created the illusion that certain families were untouchable, protected by networks of influence that extended throughout local institutions. The emergency response that her situation had triggered would demonstrate that some forms of justice operated according to different principles, enforced by people who had sworn oaths to protect American citizens from both foreign enemies and domestic threats that exceeded the capability of civilian authorities. The grain silo that had once represented honest agricultural work and community cooperation had been transformed into a symbol of how democratic institutions could be corrupted when wealthy families decided that their privilege included the right to commit violence against people they considered expendable. Emma's rescue would restore the building's original purpose as a place where honest work created value for entire communities rather than serving as a playground for predators who had never learned that actions carried consequences. Tyler Morrison's 90-second countdown was creating artificial time pressure that would actually work in favor of the rescue operation currently approaching his location with tactical precision that had been refined through years of combat operations against enemies who possessed far superior training and equipment than three pampered teenagers from rural Nebraska. His assumption that time was on his side would prove to be another fatal miscalculation in a series of errors that would transform his afternoon of entertainment into a comprehensive demonstration of federal justice. The military smartwatch that connected Emma to her sister's world of classified operations and international missions had just become the bridge between Tyler Morrison's local reign of terror and a larger universe where actions carried consequences that could not be avoided through political influence or financial resources. Emma's survival depended on maintaining consciousness for whatever time remained before that larger universe arrived to restore balance to a situation that had been distorted by years of systematic corruption and unpunished violence. Part 4: Backstory Setup. The Walsh family dairy farm had been established in 1943 by Emma and Jessica's great-grandfather William Walsh, who returned from World War II with agricultural knowledge gained during his service as a quartermaster responsible for feeding entire military units in the Pacific Theater. William's understanding of nutrition, logistics, and animal husbandry had been refined under combat conditions where failure meant that American soldiers went hungry, creating expertise that he applied to building one of Hamilton County's most efficient and productive dairy operations. 3 generations of Walsh family ownership had transformed 40 acres of marginal prairie into a model of sustainable agriculture that produced premium dairy products while maintaining environmental stewardship that enhanced rather than depleted the natural resources upon which their operation depended. The farm's success came from combining traditional farming wisdom with modern technology, creating systems that maximized efficiency while minimizing waste and environmental. Robert Walsh had inherited both the farm and the responsibility that came with feeding families throughout Hamilton County. But his military service as an Army mechanic had added dimensions to his expertise that extended far beyond dairy farming. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him skills in equipment maintenance, tactical planning, and crisis management that proved invaluable when applied to the challenges of modern agriculture. More importantly, his military experience had exposed him to the reality that evil people existed in the world and that protecting innocent lives sometimes required preparation for violence that civilians preferred not to acknowledge. The decision to send both daughters to college had required financial sacrifices that demonstrated the Walsh family's commitment to education as the foundation for future success. Emma's studies in agricultural business and rural development were designed to prepare her for eventually taking over farm operations, while Jessica's path toward military service represented her desire to serve something larger than personal interests. Both educational paths reflected the family's understanding that effective leadership required both specialized knowledge and broader perspective about how individual actions affected entire communities. Jessica's childhood had been shaped by the same work ethic and practical competence that had built the Walsh family farm, but her personality had always included elements that suggested military service as a natural career choice. She possessed natural leadership abilities that emerged during school projects and community activities, combined with physical courage that manifested during farm work that required handling large animals and dangerous equipment. Most importantly, she demonstrated the kind of protective instincts toward vulnerable people that would eventually lead her to specialize in hostage rescue and counterterrorism operations. The military smartwatch that Jessica had given Emma before her current deployment represented the intersection of her professional expertise and personal concern for her sister's safety. Jessica's specialized training had exposed her to the reality that threats against military personnel often extended to their family members, requiring protective measures that went beyond what civilian security systems could provide. The watch contained technology that was normally reserved for protecting high-value military targets, adapted for civilian use through modifications that Jessica had designed personally. Emma's college experience at the University of Nebraska had provided her with theoretical knowledge about rural development and agricultural policy, but it had also exposed her to social justice concepts that helped her understand the systematic nature of the oppression she was witnessing in Hamilton County. Her coursework in civil rights law had taught her to recognize patterns of institutional discrimination and corruption, while her studies in conflict resolution had given her frameworks for understanding how violence could be prevented through addressing underlying power imbalances. The Walsh family's position as outsiders in Hamilton County's power structure had been established over decades of refusing to participate in the corrupt relationships that connected the Morrison, Henderson, and Cooper families with local institutions. Robert Walsh's military service had taught him to recognize corruption when he saw it, while his commitment to honest business practices had prevented him from seeking the kind of political favors that might have provided his family with protection from retaliation when they failed to cooperate with illegal activities. Emma's return from college 3 weeks early had been motivated by her desire to help with summer farm work, but it had also been influenced by concerning reports from Katie Miller about escalating harassment that suggested the situation in Hamilton County was becoming more dangerous. Emma's decision to cut short her college social activities in order to provide support for a vulnerable teenager demonstrated the same protective instincts that had motivated Jessica's military service, applied to a domestic situation that required different tactics but similar commitment to defending innocent people. The abandoned Miller grain silo where Emma now found herself fighting for her life had once been the centerpiece of a cooperative agricultural operation that supported dozens of local farming families. The building's abandonment 5 years ago had symbolized the economic pressures that were forcing small farmers out of business, creating social instability that allowed predators like Tyler Morrison's group to operate without effective community resistance. The transformation of a place that had once represented community cooperation into a site for systematic violence illustrated how corruption could pervert institutions that were designed to serve public good. Katie Miller's vulnerability as the daughter of migrant workers had made her a perfect target for Tyler Morrison's group, which specialized in terrorizing people who lacked political connections or legal resources that might enable them to fight back effectively. Her parents' immigration status had been weaponized by Blake Henderson's family to ensure that complaints about violence would be dismissed as attempts to create problems for law enforcement rather than legitimate requests for protection from criminal activity. The systematic harassment that Katie had endured over the past 6 months had followed patterns that Emma recognized from her college coursework in criminal justice and civil rights law. Tyler Morrison's group had used escalating psychological pressure to isolate Katie from potential sources of support, while using their family connections to ensure that official complaints would be dismissed or redirected in ways that actually increased Katie's vulnerability to retaliation rather than providing protection from future violence. Emma's attempts to document and report the harassment Katie was experiencing had revealed the extent to which Hamilton County's institutions had been captured by corrupt interests that prioritized protecting wealthy families over serving justice for vulnerable populations. Deputy Maria Santos had warned Emma privately that pursuing official complaints would likely result in retaliation rather than protection, while school administrators had made it clear that they were more concerned about avoiding negative publicity than addressing systematic violence against students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The decision to take direct action by responding to Katie's emergency call had been made by Emma despite her understanding that she was walking into a situation where she would face overwhelming disadvantages in resources, legal protection, and political influence. Her choice to risk her own safety in order to protect a vulnerable teenager reflected the same value system that had motivated 3 generations of Walsh family commitment to serving their community through honest work and ethical business practices. The rope that currently supported Emma's weight above the grain silo's concrete floor had been professionally rigged using equipment that suggested Tyler Morrison's group had received training in climbing or rescue techniques that they were now applying for torture rather than legitimate purposes. The quality of their equipment and the efficiency of their operation indicated planning and practice that elevated their activities from random violence into something that resembled organized criminal activity with sophisticated operational capabilities. Tyler Morrison's casual expertise with strangulation techniques suggested that he had researched the topic extensively, possibly using academic resources to study human physiology in ways that enhanced his ability to inflict suffering while minimizing the risk of accidentally causing immediate death that might trigger more serious law enforcement responses. His knowledge of timing and pressure indicated that Emma was not his first victim, while his confidence suggested that previous operations had been completed without consequences that might deter future activities. Blake Henderson's use of law enforcement training and equipment to facilitate rather than prevent violent crimes represented a fundamental perversion of the authority that democratic societies entrusted to police officers for protection of vulnerable populations. His ability to monitor emergency radio frequencies and coordinate with his family's connections throughout the sheriff's department meant that Tyler Morrison's group operated with intelligence capabilities that exceeded those available to most organized criminal enterprises. Ryan Cooper's financial resources had been used to purchase military-grade surveillance and communication equipment that was supposed to be restricted to authorized law enforcement and military personnel, indicating corruption that extended far beyond local political institutions into federal agencies responsible for controlling access to sensitive technology. His ability to document crimes without fear of legal consequences suggested that his family possessed influence that could neutralize federal as well as local law enforcement responses. The pattern of systematic violence that had been terrorizing Hamilton County for years represented something far more dangerous than teenage bullying or random criminal activity. Emma had stumbled into a criminal enterprise that operated with institutional protection and tactical sophistication that challenged the fundamental assumption that democratic institutions would protect innocent people from organized oppression. Her survival would depend on resources that exceeded anything available through civilian channels, requiring intervention by people who specialized in confronting organized criminal activity that had captured local government institutions. Part 5: The Injustice. The death of Maria Gonzalez 18 months ago had been the moment when Tyler Morrison's group graduated from harassment and intimidation into systematic murder. Although the official investigation had lasted exactly 72 hours before reaching conclusions that satisfied everyone with political influence while ignoring evidence that would have supported criminal charges. Maria had been 16 years old, the daughter of agricultural workers who had been trying to establish permanent residency in Hamilton County for 3 years while saving money to bring extended family members from Guatemala to safety in the United States. Maria's academic achievements had made her a threat to the social hierarchy that Tyler Morrison's group was committed to maintaining through violence and intimidation. Her perfect attendance, straight A grades, and acceptance to the University of Nebraska on a full academic scholarship had demonstrated that intelligence and determination could overcome the disadvantages of poverty and immigration status, setting an example that challenged the fundamental assumptions about social superiority that justified wealthy families' sense of entitlement to control and exploit vulnerable populations. The official cause of Maria's death had been listed as accidental drowning during an unauthorized swimming party at the abandoned quarry that served as a popular teenage gathering place during summer months. The investigation conducted by Blake Henderson's father had concluded that Maria had been drinking alcohol and had entered the water despite being unable to swim, creating conditions that led to her tragic but inevitable death. The case had been closed without interviewing key witnesses or examining physical evidence that contradicted the official narrative. Emma's independent investigation into Maria's death had revealed evidence that was ignored or suppressed by the official investigation, including witness statements indicating that Maria had been forced into the water after being assaulted by Tyler Morrison's group and physical evidence suggesting that she had been unconscious before entering the water rather than drowning due to intoxication and inability to swim. The coroner's report had been sanitized to remove references to defensive wounds and blunt force trauma that were inconsistent with accidental drowning. The financial settlement offered to Maria's family had been accompanied by immigration threats that made acceptance seem like the only option for people whose legal status was vulnerable to administrative harassment that could result in deportation proceedings. The Gonzalez family had been forced to choose between pursuing justice for their
daughter and protecting their surviving children from retaliation that could destroy their entire family's chances for legal residence in the United States. Emma's attempts to gather additional evidence about Maria's death had led her to discover a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances that extended back 5 years, involving teenagers from vulnerable populations who had been targeted for harassment by Tyler Morrison's group before dying under circumstances that were consistently ruled accidental or suicidal by investigators who showed no interest in examining evidence that contradicted official conclusions. Carmen Rodriguez had been 17 when she was found hanging from a tree in the same grove where Tyler Morrison's group was known to conduct hazing rituals that were described by survivors as games involving psychological torture and physical assault. The suicide determination had been made despite the absence of a suicide note and the presence of ligature marks that were inconsistent with self-inflicted hanging. While witness statements describing Carmen's recent harassment by Tyler's group had been dismissed as unreliable gossip. David Kim had been 15 when his body was discovered at the bottom of a grain elevator shaft under circumstances that were ruled accidental despite evidence suggesting that he had been unconscious before falling. David's parents had been migrant workers whose limited English and immigration status had made them easy targets for intimidation when they attempted to question the official investigation, resulting in their eventual departure from Hamilton County without pursuing additional inquiries about their son's death. The pattern that emerged from Emma's research indicated that Tyler Morrison's group had been systematically targeting teenagers from vulnerable populations for increasingly violent harassment that culminated in deaths that were designed to appear accidental or suicidal while serving as warnings to other potential victims about the consequences of challenging the established social hierarchy. The official investigations into these deaths had been conducted with such obvious bias and incompetence that they suggested active participation in cover-up efforts rather than mere negligence. Emma's documentation of this pattern had been compiled into a detailed report that she had submitted to federal authorities after local law enforcement demonstrated their unwillingness to address systematic civil rights violations that were being protected by corrupt political networks. The FBI had acknowledged receipt of her complaint and had initiated a preliminary investigation, but the bureaucratic pace of federal law enforcement had failed to provide immediate protection for vulnerable populations who continued to face escalating violence. Katie Miller's harassment had followed the same escalation pattern that had preceded the deaths of Maria Gonzalez and the other victims Emma had identified. Beginning with social isolation and verbal intimidation before progressing to physical assault and threats that were designed to terrorize not just individual targets but entire communities of vulnerable people. Katie's courage in refusing to be intimidated had made her a priority target for violence that was intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance against established power structures. The specific nature of Katie's harassment had revealed the sophisticated psychological techniques that Tyler Morrison's group used to maximize their victims' suffering while minimizing their own legal exposure. They had conducted detailed research into Katie's family situation, using their knowledge of immigration law and enforcement procedures to create threats that were specifically designed to exploit her parents' vulnerability to deportation proceedings that could be initiated through anonymous complaints to federal immigration authorities. Tyler Morrison's personal involvement in Katie's harassment had escalated beyond the delegated violence that he typically used to maintain distance between himself and criminal activity that might generate legal consequences. His direct participation in today's assault indicated that Katie's refusal to be intimidated had triggered the kind of personal attention that historically preceded the transition from harassment to murder in the pattern Emma had identified through her research. Blake Henderson's use of his family's law enforcement connections to facilitate rather than prevent Tyler's crimes had provided the group with intelligence about potential investigations and early warning about any law enforcement activities that might interfere with their operations.
operations. His access to police radio frequencies and investigative files had allowed the group to stay ahead of any official responses while using law enforcement resources to intimidate witnesses and suppress evidence. Ryan Cooper's financial resources had been used to purchase influence throughout Hamilton County's political and legal institutions, ensuring that Tyler Morrison's group could operate with virtual impunity regardless of the severity of their crimes or the amount of evidence that supported criminal charges against them. His family's control over mortgage financing and business loans had created a network of economic dependence that discouraged community resistance to systematic violence against vulnerable populations. The grain silo where Emma now found herself fighting for her life had been the site of at least 3 previous murders disguised as accidents or suicides. According to evidence Emma had compiled through interviews with witnesses who had been too intimidated to cooperate with official investigations, the building's isolation and acoustic properties had made it an ideal location for violence that required privacy, while its structural condition provided convenient explanations for deaths that could be attributed to curiosity about dangerous buildings rather than systematic murder. Emma's current situation represented the culmination of years of escalating violence that had been enabled by institutional corruption and community intimidation. But it also represented the first time that Tyler Morrison's group had targeted someone with connections that extended beyond Hamilton County's captured political and legal institutions. Emma's family relationships included resources that operated according to different rules and answered to higher authorities, creating the possibility that systematic violence might finally encounter consequences that could not be avoided through local political influence. The military smartwatch that connected Emma to Jessica's world of classified operations and federal law enforcement resources had just become the bridge between Hamilton County's lawless territory and a larger universe, where civil rights violations against American citizens triggered responses that were designed to restore democratic institutions through the application of overwhelming force against organized criminal activity. Tyler Morrison's afternoon of entertainment was about to become a comprehensive demonstration of what happened when predators finally encountered prey that possessed superior training, better equipment, and the absolute determination to ensure that justice would be served regardless of local political arrangements. The systematic oppression that had terrorized Hamilton County for years was about to encounter the kind of resistance that democratic societies maintained, specifically to protect vulnerable populations from organized criminal activity that captured local institutions through corruption and intimidation. Emma's survival would depend on maintaining consciousness until that resistance arrived with military precision and federal legal authority that transcended local power structures, transforming her personal crisis into a larger confrontation between systematic evil and the institutional forces that democratic societies maintain to protect their most vulnerable citizens. Part 6, Investigation Phase. The evidence that Emma had been systematically collecting over the past 18 months filled 3 composition notebooks that she kept hidden in her college dormitory room, each page documenting incidents of harassment, assault, and suspicious deaths that revealed a pattern of criminal activity operating under the protection of Hamilton County's corrupt institutional network. Her investigation had begun as a personal quest to understand what had really happened to Maria Gonzalez, but it had evolved into a comprehensive documentation of systematic civil rights violations that extended far beyond individual acts of violence. Emma's methodical approach to evidence gathering reflected both her academic training in agricultural business and research methods, and her family's military tradition of thorough preparation and attention to detail that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Each incident she documented included detailed timelines, witness statements obtained through careful relationship building, and physical evidence that she had photographed and preserved according to protocols she had learned from online courses in criminal investigation and forensic documentation. The most damning evidence in Emma's collection consisted of financial records that she had obtained through her part-time job at the Hamilton County Tax Assessor's Office, where her responsibilities for digitizing historical property records had provided her with access to information that revealed how the Morrison, Henderson, and Cooper families had systematically acquired control over local institutions through strategic purchases, political donations, and economic pressure that amounted to a coordinated campaign to capture democratic governance for private criminal purposes. Emma's analysis of property ownership patterns had revealed that Tyler Morrison's family had purchased the abandoned Miller grain silo through a shell corporation specifically to prevent its demolition, ensuring that they would continue to have access to an isolated location where violent crimes could be committed without interference from potential witnesses or law enforcement surveillance. The legal arrangements that protected their ownership of the property included clauses that prohibited public access while exempting family members and designated associates from trespassing restrictions. The financial investigation that Emma had conducted into Blake Henderson's family revealed systematic misuse of law enforcement resources and budget allocations that amounted to converting public safety funds into a private security service for wealthy families who faced potential criminal prosecution. Blake's father had used his position as sheriff to hire deputies based on their willingness to ignore or actively cover up criminal activity rather than their qualifications for legitimate law enforcement duties, creating a department that functioned more like a criminal organization than a public safety agency. Ryan Cooper's family banking empire had been built on laundering money obtained through illegal activities that included drug trafficking, human trafficking, and systematic extortion of vulnerable populations who lacked legal recourse when their businesses, farms, or families were threatened with financial destruction. Emma's review of suspicious financial transactions had identified patterns of cash deposits and wire transfers that suggested coordination with organized crime networks that operated throughout the Midwest, using Hamilton County as a safe haven where criminal activity could be conducted without interference from honest law enforcement. The most disturbing aspect of Emma's investigation had been her discovery that the systematic violence against vulnerable teenagers was being used not just to maintain social control within Hamilton County, but also to provide a source of victims for human trafficking operations that supplied larger criminal networks with young people who would not be missed by authorities who had been trained to dismiss reports of missing persons from immigrant and agricultural worker families. The deaths that were being disguised as accidents and suicides were actually covering up the disappearance of teenagers who were being sold into various forms of slavery and exploitation. Emma's attempts to share her evidence with federal authorities had been complicated by the fact that several FBI agents assigned to investigate corruption in rural Nebraska had family connections to the Cooper banking empire, creating conflicts of interest that compromised the integrity of federal law enforcement responses to systematic criminal activity. Her reports to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice had generated automated responses acknowledging receipt of her complaints but had not resulted in any visible law enforcement activity that might protect vulnerable populations from continued victimization. The breakthrough in Emma's investigation had come when she discovered that Tyler Morrison's group was using encrypted messaging applications to coordinate their criminal activities. But they were also maintaining detailed records of their victims and their crimes as insurance against potential betrayal by co-conspirators who might attempt to negotiate reduced sentences by providing evidence against other participants. Emma's computer science coursework had taught her enough about digital forensics to understand that these records could be retrieved if law enforcement agencies with proper technical capabilities were willing to invest the resources necessary for comprehensive investigation. Emma's most recent discovery had been evidence that Katie Miller was being targeted not just for harassment and potential murder, but for abduction and sale to human trafficking networks that had been requesting specific types of victims to satisfy customer preferences that included young women with Katie's physical characteristics and family backgrounds. The timeline that Emma had reconstructed suggested that Katie's murder would have been staged to cover up her disappearance, allowing Tyler Morrison's group to profit from her sale while maintaining their reputation as dangerous but ultimately local criminals rather than participants in international trafficking operations. The decision to take direct action by responding to Katie's emergency call had been motivated by Emma's understanding that federal law enforcement responses to her evidence would not arrive in time to prevent Katie's murder and disappearance. and that local authorities were either compromised by corruption or intimidated by retaliation threats that made them unwilling to provide protection for vulnerable populations. Emma's choice to risk her own safety represented her conclusion that moral responsibility sometimes required individual action when institutional systems failed to protect innocent people. The military smartwatch that connected Emma to Jessica's tactical capabilities had been programmed with protocols that would automatically transmit Emma's evidence files to federal law enforcement agencies if her biometric readings indicated life-threatening danger, ensuring that her investigation would survive even if she did not, and that prosecutions could proceed based on documentation that would be admissible in federal court. The device contained encrypted storage capacity that held copies of every document, photograph, and audio recording that Emma had collected during her 18-month investigation. Emma's understanding of the legal framework that would enable federal prosecution of Tyler Morrison's criminal network had been enhanced by her college coursework in criminal justice and civil rights law, providing her with knowledge about jurisdictional issues and evidence requirements that had guided her documentation efforts toward producing materials that would be usable by federal prosecutors who specialized in organized crime and civil rights violations. Her evidence had been organized according to federal sentencing guidelines that would support life imprisonment sentences for the most serious crimes while providing framework for prosecuting the entire network of corruption and complicity. The pattern of systematic violence that Emma had documented revealed that Tyler Morrison's group was following operational protocols that suggested training or consultation with organized crime professionals who possessed expertise in managing criminal enterprises that required coordination between multiple participants and protection from law enforcement interference. The sophistication of their operations exceeded what might be expected from wealthy teenagers acting on impulse, indicating involvement by adult criminals who were using the young men as expendable operators while maintaining distance from activities that might generate federal attention. Emma's investigation had also revealed that similar criminal networks were operating in rural communities throughout Nebraska and surrounding states, suggesting that Hamilton County represented one node in a larger criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting the isolation and limited law enforcement resources that characterized agricultural regions throughout the Midwest. The scope of this criminal activity indicated that Emma's evidence could support federal prosecution efforts that would dismantle organized crime operations across multiple states and jurisdictions. The grain silo where Emma currently fought for her life had been the site of at least 7 murders over the past 3 years, according to evidence that Emma had compiled through interviews with witnesses who had been too intimidated to cooperate with official investigations but who were willing to share information with a college student whose family connections suggested that she might be able to provide protection from retaliation. The building's isolation and structural characteristics had made it an ideal location for crimes that required privacy while providing convenient explanations for deaths that could be attributed to accident or suicide. Emma's documentation of the financial arrangements that enabled Tyler Morrison's criminal operations had revealed that the group was being funded through accounts that received regular deposits from sources that included drug trafficking profits, human trafficking proceeds, and extortion payments from businesses and individuals who were being threatened with violence if they refused to pay for protection. The scale of these financial operations indicated that Emma had uncovered criminal activity that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue while operating under the protection of corrupt local institutions. The most damaging evidence in Emma's collection consisted of audio recordings that she had obtained through careful placement of surveillance equipment in locations where Tyler Morrison's group conducted planning meetings for their criminal activities. These recordings contained detailed discussions of past murders, plans for future crimes, and explicit references to their protection from prosecution through family connections and political influence. The audio quality was sufficient to support federal prosecution while providing evidence of premeditation and conspiracy that would justify the most serious criminal charges available under federal law. Emma's investigation had also documented the specific methods that Tyler Morrison's group used to select and target their victims, revealing systematic patterns of discrimination that violated federal civil rights laws while demonstrating the calculated nature of their criminal activity. Their target selection criteria included vulnerability factors such as immigration status, family economic circumstances, and social isolation that made victims unlikely to receive protection from local authorities or media attention that might generate public pressure for law enforcement action. The evidence that Emma had compiled over 18 months of careful investigation represented the most comprehensive documentation of systematic criminal activity and institutional corruption that had ever been assembled about Hamilton County, providing federal prosecutors with materials that would support multiple life imprisonment sentences while enabling civil rights enforcement actions that could restore democratic governance to a community that had been captured by organized crime. Her current crisis had triggered the transmission of this evidence to federal agencies that possessed the legal authority and tactical capabilities necessary to dismantle the entire criminal network that had terrorized vulnerable populations for years. Part 7. Inciting Incident. The scream that shattered the peaceful afternoon air across the Walsh family dairy farm carried frequencies that Emma's military training had taught her to recognize as genuine terror rather than the theatrical distress that teenagers sometimes use to attract attention or manipulate social situations. The sound originated from the direction of the abandoned Miller grain silo, a location that Emma knew had become the preferred site for Tyler Morrison's most serious criminal activities based on her 18 months of systematic evidence gathering and witness interviews. Emma's immediate response to drop her farm equipment and run toward the source of Katie Miller's distress reflected both her protective instincts and her understanding that hesitation could mean the difference between rescue and murder for a vulnerable teenager who had already survived multiple attempts by Tyler Morrison's group to escalate their harassment into the kind of violence that had claimed the lives of Maria Gonzalez and at least 6 other young people over the past 3 years. The military smartwatch on Emma's wrist automatically activated its emergency monitoring protocols as her heart rate and movement patterns indicated transition from routine farm work to potential combat situation, beginning the transmission of biometric data and GPS coordinates to Jessica's tactical unit while simultaneously recording audio and environmental data that would provide real-time intelligence about whatever crisis was developing at the grain silo. The device had been programmed to recognize specific patterns of physiological stress that indicated Emma was responding to life-threatening situations rather than routine physical exertion. Emma's approach to the grain silo followed tactical movement principles that Jessica had taught her during childhood games that were actually disguised military training, using available cover to minimize her visibility while maintaining sight lines that would allow her to assess the situation before committing to direct intervention. Her farm work had provided her with intimate knowledge of the terrain between the Walsh property and the Miller silo, including drainage ditches, fence lines, and equipment storage areas that could provide concealment during approach and potential escape routes if tactical withdrawal became necessary. The scene that Emma discovered when she reached visual range of the grain silo confirmed her worst fears about what Tyler Morrison's group was planning for Katie Miller, while simultaneously revealing the extent to which their criminal operations had evolved beyond the harassment and intimidation that had characterized their earlier activities. Katie was bound with professional quality restraints and suspended from rigging that indicated extensive planning and preparation, while Tyler, Blake, and Ryan moved with coordinated efficiency that suggested they had rehearsed this operation multiple times using previous victims. Katie's physical condition indicated that she had been subjected to systematic torture designed to break her psychological resistance before the final phase of whatever violence Tyler Morrison's group had planned for her elimination. While her positioning within the grain silo suggested that her death would be staged to appear accidental in the same way that previous murders had been disguised to avoid generating law enforcement investigations that might threaten the criminal network's operational security, Emma's tactical assessment of the situation revealed that Tyler Morrison's group had learned from their previous operations to establish security perimeters and communication protocols that would provide early warning about potential interference, while positioning themselves to control all access routes to the grain silo and maintain radio contact with lookouts who could alert them to approaching law enforcement or other potential threats. Their operational sophistication exceeded what might be expected from wealthy teenagers, suggesting training or consultation with professional criminals. The decision to attempt immediate rescue rather than retreating to summon help was made by Emma based on her understanding that Katie's survival window was measured in minutes rather than hours, and that the communication interception capabilities that Blake Henderson's law enforcement connections provided to Tyler Morrison's group would likely enable them to detect and counter any conventional emergency response before civilian authorities could arrive with sufficient force to overcome their tactical advantages. Emma's approach strategy was designed to exploit the psychological profile that she had developed for Tyler Morrison's group through 18 months of observation and evidence gathering, using their overconfidence and assumption of superiority to create opportunities for tactical surprise while relying on their inexperience with opponents who possessed actual training in violence and crisis management. Her goal was to create enough confusion and disruption to enable Katie's escape while activating her own emergency protocols that would bring federal law enforcement response with overwhelming tactical superiority. The military training that Emma had received from Jessica during family visits and summer activities had been disguised as games and fitness activities, but it had provided her with basic knowledge of tactical movement, situational awareness, and combat psychology that was now proving crucial for survival in a situation that required split-second decision-making under extreme stress. Jessica's insistence that Emma practice emergency procedures until they became muscle memory was enabling her to function effectively despite the terror and adrenaline that would normally impair cognitive function. Emma's confrontation with Tyler Morrison's group began with her attempt to use verbal de-escalation techniques that she had learned from conflict resolution coursework, appealing to their self-interest by pointing out the legal and social consequences that would result from escalating their harassment into murder while offering them opportunities to withdraw from the situation without losing face or admitting wrongdoing. Her approach was designed to buy time while her emergency transmissions reached Jessica's tactical unit and began generating federal law enforcement response. Tyler Morrison's reaction to Emma's intervention revealed the extent to which his group had committed to violence as their primary method for maintaining social control in criminal operations. While his casual dismissal of her arguments about legal consequences demonstrated his confidence that family political connections would continue to provide protection from prosecution regardless of the severity of their crimes, his decision to escalate rather than de-escalate the confrontation indicated that Emma's interference had triggered protocols designed to eliminate witnesses rather than avoid additional victims. Blake
Henderson's use of law enforcement training and equipment to facilitate assault rather than prevent it represented a fundamental perversion of the authority that democratic societies entrusted to police officers for protection of vulnerable populations. While his coordination with Tyler Morrison revealed the extent to which law enforcement resources were being systematically misused to enable rather than investigate criminal activity, his confidence in using official training for unofficial violence demonstrated the complete capture of local law enforcement by criminal interests. Ryan Cooper's financial resources had been used to purchase surveillance and communication equipment that provided Tyler Morrison's group with intelligence capabilities that exceeded those available to most law enforcement agencies, while his systematic documentation of their crimes indicated that violence had become entertainment for wealthy teenagers who possessed sufficient political protection to believe themselves immune from consequences regardless of the severity of their actions. The attack that followed Emma's attempt at peaceful intervention was coordinated with military precision, using multiple vectors and professional techniques that indicated extensive training or consultation with people who possessed expertise in violence and tactical operations.
while the efficiency with which Emma was restrained and suspended suggested that her capture had been anticipated and prepared for as soon as her investigation into their criminal activities had been detected through their surveillance and intelligence networks. Emma's suspension from the grain silo's metal framework had been accomplished using equipment and techniques that indicated professional-level expertise in rigging and rope work, while the precision with which her restraints had been applied suggested knowledge of human anatomy and physiology that enabled Tyler Morrison's group to maximize her suffering while maintaining precise control over the timing of her death to ensure that it would appear accidental to any subsequent investigation. The psychological torture that accompanied Emma's physical restraint was designed to break her resistance while providing entertainment for her attackers, but it also served operational purposes by encouraging her to reveal information about her investigation and any evidence that she might have shared with law enforcement agencies that could threaten the security of Tyler Morrison's criminal network. Their interrogation techniques revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure and information extraction that exceeded typical criminal capabilities. Emma's controlled response to her situation was enabled by training that Jessica had provided specifically for survival in hostile captivity situations, using breathing techniques and mental disciplines that maintained consciousness and cognitive function while conserving physical energy for whatever opportunities might develop for escape or rescue. Her ability to remain calm under extreme stress was creating psychological pressure on her attackers, who expected panic and desperation rather than tactical assessment and strategic thinking. The military smartwatch that connected Emma to Jessica's world of federal law enforcement and tactical response capabilities was continuing to transmit real-time intelligence about Tyler Morrison's criminal operations while providing GPS coordinates and audio documentation that would enable precision targeting for whatever rescue operation was currently being organized in response to Emma's emergency signals. The device was designed to function as both personal protection system and evidence-gathering platform that could support federal prosecution even if rescue efforts failed. Tyler Morrison's announcement of Emma's survival timeline was being recorded and transmitted to federal agencies that specialized in hostage rescue operations, providing tactical intelligence about perpetrator psychology and operational constraints, while enabling rescue teams to plan precision timing for intervention that would maximize Emma's chances of survival while ensuring capture of all participants in criminal activity that now included kidnapping and attempted murder of witnesses to ongoing federal investigations. Part 8. Confrontation Escalation. The moment Emma appeared at the grain silo entrance demanding Katie's release, Tyler Morrison's casual demeanor shifted into something far more dangerous, as he recognized that his group's operational security had been compromised by someone who possessed knowledge about their criminal activities, and the confidence to challenge them directly. Despite the obvious risks involved in confronting wealthy teenagers who had demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their interests and maintain their social position, Tyler's immediate tactical assessment of Emma's intervention revealed his sophisticated understanding of threat evaluation and response planning, as he quickly determined that her interference represented a more serious challenge than the usual adult attempts to limit his group's activities through conventional disciplinary or legal channels that could be neutralized through family political connections and financial influence. Emma's direct action approach suggested access to resources or support systems that operated outside Hamilton County's captured institutional framework. The coordination between Tyler Blake and Ryan during their response to Emma's challenge demonstrated operational discipline that exceeded typical criminal capabilities, as they smoothly transitioned from victim processing to threat neutralization using predetermined protocols that indicated extensive planning and practice for situations where their criminal activities might be interrupted by unexpected interference from people who could not be intimidated through conventional threats or legal harassment. Blake Henderson's immediate activation of his family's law enforcement surveillance network revealed the extent to which Sheriff's Department resources had been systematically converted into intelligence gathering and security services for criminal operations, as he used official radio frequencies and equipment to coordinate early warning systems while monitoring emergency response communications that might indicate civilian authorities were responding to reports of suspicious activity at the grain silo. Ryan Cooper's deployment of electronic countermeasures equipment demonstrated the sophistication of the criminal network's operational capabilities, as he activated signal jamming devices that would prevent Emma or Katie from using civilian cell phone networks to summon help while ensuring that their criminal activities would not be detected by casual surveillance or accidental discovery by people who might be traveling through the area during the commission of their crimes. The escalation from harassment and intimidation to direct assault against Emma occurred with practiced efficiency that revealed Tyler Morrison's group had established standard procedures for dealing with witnesses or interfering parties who could not be controlled through conventional threats, while their coordination and tactical execution suggested training or consultation with professional criminals who possessed expertise in violence and operational security that extended far beyond typical teenage criminal activity. Emma's attempt to use verbal de-escalation techniques was met with increasingly aggressive responses that revealed Tyler Morrison's psychological profile as someone who interpreted attempts at peaceful resolution as signs of weakness that justified escalation rather than opportunities for face-saving withdrawal. While his casual references to previous victims indicated that violence had become his preferred method for resolving any situation that challenged his sense of absolute authority over vulnerable populations, the professional quality of the restraints and rigging equipment that Tyler Morrison's group used to subdue Emma revealed systematic preparation and investment in tools that were designed for repeated use in criminal operations. While their efficiency in applying these restraints suggested extensive practice and refinement of techniques that maximized victim helplessness while minimizing the time and effort required for complete control of the tactical situation. Blake Henderson's use of law enforcement interrogation techniques to extract information from Emma about her investigation and any evidence she might have shared with federal authorities demonstrated the complete perversion of police training that was supposed to protect citizens into methods for facilitating criminal operations, while his knowledge of proper procedures for destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses revealed systematic corruption that extended throughout Hamilton County's law enforcement hierarchy. Ryan Cooper's systematic documentation of Emma's torture served multiple operational purposes beyond sadistic entertainment, as his recordings would provide insurance against potential betrayal by co-conspirators while creating detailed evidence of Emma's statements that could be edited and manipulated to support false narratives about her death. If subsequent investigations threatened to expose the criminal network's activities or challenge official conclusions about accidental death or suicide, the grain silo's acoustic properties amplified every sound of Emma's struggle and her attackers' casual conversation about timing and technique, creating an audio environment that intensified the psychological pressure while providing clear documentation of premeditation and coordination that would support the most serious criminal charges available under federal law. Once Emma's emergency transmissions brought law enforcement response with sufficient tactical capabilities to overcome local corruption and political protection. Emma's recognition that she was facing opponents who possessed training and equipment that exceeded normal criminal capabilities forced her to revise her tactical assessment and survival strategies, as she realized that Tyler Morrison's group represented something far more dangerous than wealthy teenagers acting on impulse or peer pressure, but rather constituted a sophisticated criminal organization that had been systematically developed to exploit vulnerable populations while operating under protection from corrupt institutional networks. The methodical approach that Tyler Morrison's group used to prepare Emma for whatever violence they had planned revealed operational protocols that had been refined through previous criminal activities, while their casual discussion of timing and technique indicated extensive knowledge of human physiology and death investigation procedures that would enable them to control the circumstances of Emma's death to ensure that it would be classified as accidental rather than homicide by corrupt investigators. Tyler Morrison's detailed knowledge of strangulation mechanics and timing demonstrated research and study that elevated his criminal activities from random violence into systematic application of knowledge designed to maximize victim suffering while ensuring predictable outcomes that could be concealed through false official narratives. While his confidence in sharing this information suggested absolute trust in his political protection and the loyalty of his co-conspirators, Blake Henderson's coordination with Sheriff's Department personnel during Emma's assault revealed real-time communication with corrupt law enforcement officers who were actively participating in criminal operations by providing security perimeter monitoring and early warning about potential interference. While their casual discussion of evidence destruction and witness intimidation indicated systematic preparation for covering up crimes that had been planned in advance rather than committed on impulse, Ryan Cooper's financial resources had been used to purchase military-grade surveillance equipment that provided Tyler Morrison's group with intelligence capabilities that enabled them to monitor law enforcement communications and detect potential threats to their operational security. While his systematic investment in criminal infrastructure indicated long-term planning and coordination with professional criminal organizations that operated beyond Hamilton County's borders, the professional rigging that suspended Emma above the grain silo's concrete floor had been designed to provide precise control over the timing and manner of her death, while ensuring that physical evidence would support whatever false narrative Tyler Morrison's group had prepared to explain her presence at the location and the circumstances that led to her fatal injuries. While the quality of their equipment indicated access to specialized knowledge and resources that exceeded normal criminal capabilities, Emma's suspension from the metal framework created tactical vulnerability that prevented her from defending herself or escaping, while positioning her for maximum psychological impact on Katie Miller, who was being forced to witness the consequences of resistance to Tyler Morrison's authority as a warning about what would happen to other vulnerable teenagers who refused to accept their assigned position in Hamilton County's social hierarchy. The casual conversation between Tyler Blake and Ryan during Emma's torture revealed their complete dehumanization of victims who they regarded as expendable entertainment rather than human beings deserving of basic rights and protections. While their systematic approach to violence indicated psychological conditioning and ideological framework that justified unlimited brutality against people they considered inferior based on social class, immigration status, or other characteristics that marked them as legitimate targets for exploitation. Tyler Morrison's references to previous victims during Emma's assault provided detailed confession to multiple murders that had been disguised as accidents or suicides, while his confidence in sharing the information demonstrated absolute trust in his political protection and the effectiveness of corruption networks that had enabled his criminal activities to continue without interference from law enforcement agencies that were supposed to protect vulnerable populations from systematic violence. The grain silo's isolation had been selected specifically to ensure that Tyler Morrison's criminal activities could be conducted without interference from potential witnesses or law enforcement surveillance. While the building's structural characteristics provided tactical advantages for criminals while creating convenient explanations for deaths that could be attributed to curiosity about dangerous buildings rather than systematic murder conducted by organized criminal networks, Emma's military training enabled her to maintain tactical awareness and strategic thinking despite the extreme physical and psychological stress of her situation, while her understanding of Tyler Morrison's psychological profile and operational methods allowed her to recognize opportunities for survival that required precise timing and coordination with whatever rescue operations her emergency transmissions were generating through Jessica's tactical unit and federal law enforcement response capabilities. Part 9. The Trap Springs. The attack on Emma came from 3 directions simultaneously, executed with military precision that revealed Tyler Morrison's group had received professional training in coordinated assault techniques that went far beyond what wealthy teenagers might learn through sports activities or casual violence, suggesting consultation with organized crime professionals who specialized in systematic intimidation and elimination of witnesses who threatened criminal operations through investigation or testimony. Tyler Morrison's personal assault on Emma began with psychological warfare designed to break her resistance before physical violence commenced, as he detailed the fate that had befallen previous victims who had attempted to interfere with his criminal operations, while describing the specific tortures that Emma would endure before her death was staged to appear accidental to corrupt investigators who had been trained to reach predetermined conclusions regardless of physical evidence. Blake Henderson's role in the coordinated attack involved using law enforcement restraint techniques that were supposed to be applied for legitimate police work but were now being perverted to facilitate criminal violence. While his detailed knowledge of pressure points and submission holds enabled Tyler Morrison's group to subdue Emma with minimal risk to themselves while maximizing her pain and helplessness during the restraint process. Ryan Cooper's contribution to Emma's capture involved electronic warfare capabilities that jammed her cell phone communications while monitoring emergency radio frequencies to ensure that civilian authorities would not be able to respond to any distress calls that might be generated by witnesses to their criminal activities. While his systematic documentation of the assault provided evidence that could be used for blackmail or intimidation of Emma's family members if they attempted to pursue justice through official channels, the professional quality of the rope and rigging equipment that Tyler Morrison's group used to suspend Emma from the grain silo's metal framework revealed systematic investment in tools designed for repeated criminal use. While the efficiency with which they applied these restraints demonstrated extensive practice and refinement of techniques that had been developed through previous operations against victims who lacked Emma's hidden advantages and tactical support systems, Emma's strategic response to her capture reflected training that Jessica had provided for survival in hostile situations as she immediately activated emergency protocols built into her military smartwatch while using breathing techniques and mental disciplines that would maintain consciousness and cognitive function during whatever torture Tyler Morrison's group had planned before staging her death to appear accidental to investigators who had been corrupted to protect criminal operations. The military smartwatch concealed beneath Emma's restraints was transmitting real-time intelligence about Tyler Morrison's criminal operations to Jessica's tactical unit while providing GPS coordinates and biometric data that would enable precision rescue operations, but more importantly, the device was recording detailed audio and video evidence of criminal activity that would support federal prosecution even if rescue efforts failed to save Emma's life. Tyler Morrison's decision to escalate from harassment and intimidation to attempted murder revealed the extent to which his criminal operations had evolved into systematic elimination of witnesses and potential threats, while his casual discussion of previous victims provided detailed confession to multiple murders that federal prosecutors would use to support life imprisonment sentences once law enforcement agencies with sufficient tactical capabilities arrived to overcome local corruption and political protection. Blake Henderson's use of Sheriff's Department communications equipment to coordinate security for criminal operations revealed the complete capture of law enforcement resources by organized crime interests, while his real-time coordination with corrupt deputies who were providing perimeter security demonstrated systematic institutional corruption that would require federal intervention to restore legitimate law enforcement capabilities to Hamilton County. Ryan Cooper's financial resources had been used to purchase surveillance and counter-surveillance equipment that provided Tyler Morrison's group with intelligence capabilities that exceeded those available to most civilian law enforcement agencies, while his systematic investment in criminal infrastructure indicated coordination with professional criminal organizations that operated across state boundaries and required federal rather than local law enforcement response. The grain silo's acoustic properties created an environment where every sound of Emma's struggle and her attacker's conversation was amplified and recorded by her emergency transmission equipment, providing federal law enforcement agencies with real-time intelligence about criminal operations while creating detailed evidence of premeditation and coordination that would support the most serious charges available under federal criminal law. Emma's controlled breathing techniques enabled her to maintain consciousness and tactical awareness despite the physical stress of suspension and restraint, while her understanding of Tyler Morrison's psychological profile allowed her to recognize that his need to demonstrate superiority through detailed explanations of his criminal activities was providing crucial intelligence about criminal operations to law enforcement agencies that were receiving her emergency transmissions. The methodical approach that Tyler Morrison's group used to prepare Emma for murder revealed operational protocols that had been refined through extensive practice on previous victims, while their casual discussion of evidence destruction and official cover-up procedures indicated systematic coordination with corrupt investigators who had been trained to reach predetermined conclusions regardless of physical evidence that contradicted official narratives about accidental death or suicide. Tyler Morrison's detailed knowledge of human physiology and death investigation procedures demonstrated research and preparation that elevated his criminal activities from random violence into systematic application of scientific knowledge designed to ensure predictable outcomes that could be concealed through manipulation of official investigations, while his confidence in sharing this information revealed absolute trust in political protection and institutional corruption. Blake Henderson's coordination with corrupt law enforcement personnel during Emma's torture provided real-time intelligence about potential threats to their operational security while ensuring that civilian emergency response capabilities would be neutralized before they could interfere with criminal operations, revealing systematic institutional capture that extended throughout Hamilton County's political and law enforcement hierarchy. Ryan Cooper's systematic documentation of Emma's assault served operational purposes beyond entertainment, as his recordings would provide insurance against potential betrayal by co-conspirators while creating evidence that could be manipulated to support false narratives about Emma's death. Subsequent federal investigations threatened to expose the criminal network's activities or challenge corrupt official conclusions. The professional rigging that suspended Emma above the concrete floor had been designed to provide precise control over the timing and manner of her death while ensuring that physical evidence would support whatever false narrative Tyler Morrison's group had prepared to explain her presence at the location. While the sophistication of their equipment indicated access to specialized knowledge and resources that suggested coordination with organized crime professionals, Emma's recognition that she was facing a sophisticated criminal organization rather than random teenage violence forced her to revise her survival strategies while relying on training that Jessica had provided for situations where conventional help would be inadequate or unavailable, requiring her to endure extreme physical and psychological stress while waiting for tactical support that operated according to different rules and possessed capabilities that exceeded local criminal resources. The military protocols built into Emma's emergency transmission system had been designed specifically for situations where civilian authorities were compromised by corruption or inadequate to address organized criminal activity, automatically escalating her distress signal to federal agencies with sufficient legal authority and tactical capabilities to intervene regardless of local political resistance or institutional protection for criminal operations. Tyler Morrison's casual references to previous murders during Emma's torture provided federal law enforcement agencies with detailed confession to systematic criminal activity that would support prosecution under federal civil rights laws and organized crime statutes. While his confidence in sharing this information demonstrated the extent to which local political protection had created an environment where criminals believed themselves immune from consequences regardless of the severity of their actions, the grain silo that had once represented honest agricultural work and community cooperation had been transformed into a symbol of how democratic institutions could be corrupted when wealthy families decided that their privilege included the right to commit systematic violence against vulnerable populations. While Emma's current crisis was generating federal law enforcement response that would restore institutional integrity through application of overwhelming tactical superiority and legal authority that transcended local corruption networks. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.